Good evening. Welcome to Colerain Township's Board of Zoning Appeals meeting for Wednesday, September 26, 2018. We will begin with the Pledge of Allegiance, so if you would please stand. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. In the event that some of you have not been here to bring an appeal before the Board of Zoning Appeals, I'm going to go over a brief explanation of what it is we're about to do this evening. The first activity will be a listing of the primary functions of the board, and the second will be a sequence of activities that we're going to go through. The primary functions of the BZA are to hear appeals from the administrative interpretation of zoning code, such as the administrative denial of a zoning permit, hear requests for variances, hear requests for conditional uses, and finally, hearing requests for expansion or changes to non-conforming use or building. The sequence of events is as follows. The staff will present an overview of each case. That presentation will include photos, diagrams, and other materials pertinent to the case. They will also make a recommendation to the board as to disposition. The chairman will next open the hearing to the appellant to present his or her case. Following this, anyone who is opposed to the appeal will be allowed to speak. After comments for and against the appeal have been heard, the chairman will close the public portion of the comments, and then each board member will then address the questions to the appellant, to the staff, and as appropriate, those opposed. After questions have been answered to the satisfaction of the board, the chairman will ask for a motion to approve or deny the request, and the vote is the final action of the board. And just for housekeeping, for the public, please make all comments from the podium. All testimony is transcribed. It is important that the transcriber hear your testimony correctly. The nature of the BZA is quasi-judicial. Respect for and by every participant is paramount. The chairman reserves the right to excuse anyone from the hearing who's displaying disruptive behavior. We'll go into a roll call vote, please. A roll call, rather.
Ms. Wilson?
Present.
Mr. Bartle?
Here.
Mr. Roberto? Mr. Reinger?
Here. And we have a vacancy, and that we will have to seat our alternates to complete the board. So at this time, I will ask, we have both alternates here tonight. Sam, if you would just come up to Diaz and be seated. Also, yeah. Thank you both for being here. It helps to have a full quorum. The next activity is going to be the swearing in for anyone who wishes to provide testimony. So at this time, anyone who wishes to provide testimony, I'm going to ask to stand, raise your right hand, and repeat after me. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that you will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in matters before the Board of Zoning Appeals? Say, I do. Thank you very much. Another piece of housekeeping. Hopefully anyone who's testifying has signed in these sheets for the particular case that you're appearing for. If not, when you come up to the podium, I'll ask you to do so. The next order of business is going to be the hearing of appeals. And at this point, I'm going to ask for a motion to change the order of the agenda and to rebalance how we're going to go through the appeals. What I'm going to ask is for the BZA 2018-014 to be heard first, followed by BZA 2018-012 second, and the last one will be BZA 2018 013 third. I would like a motion to change the order of the agenda to that.
I'll make the motion.
Second.
Motion's been made and seconded. Any discussion on that change? Okay. If not, I'll ask for a roll call vote, please.
Ms. Wilson?
Aye.
Mr. Bartold?
Yes.
Mr. Shup? Mr. Hill?
Yes.
Mr. Ranger?
Aye. All right. At this point, we will begin with the staff presentation for BZA 2018-014. It's a request for variance for a temporary signage. The variance is for section 13.1, 13.10, 3 bracket B and 3 bracket B, and location is 9459 Colerain Avenue. The applicant owner is T. Northgate Pads. Staff, please.
Thank you, Mr. Ranger. We have a relatively brief presentation on this matter this evening. The applicant is requesting to lengthen the time that they are allowed to place temporary signage on their business located at the southeastern corner of the Northgate Mall site, as identified there on the screen. This is a vacant portion of the building that currently houses Kabuto. I think there's a Sprint Mobile in there and a Life Uniforms. The applicant currently has a sign permit for temporary signage that will expire on September 30th, 2018, and their request this evening is to extend that permitted time period to include October 1st, 2018 through October 31st, 2018. The requested signs are 30 square feet total. There are 2 signs that they're placing up on the wall. Temporary signs less than 6 square feet are permitted without a zoning certificate. Signs over 8 square feet and less than 32 square feet require a zoning certificate. But again, those are only allowed for 30 days. Up to 4 times a year, but there has to be a gap between that. Aerial view looking south on Colerain Avenue, you can see the property location. It's Old Tuesday Morning location. And here's an image of the requested signs on the face of the building there. 2 signs, 3 foot by 5 foot each, 30 square feet total. So we're actually under the 32 square foot requirement for 1 sign. They've just broken it up into 2. Again, this is what the code says. New businesses allowing to have signs up to 30 consecutive days. The reason that the applicant is requesting for this extension rather than for permanent signage is that they are a temporary business. Each year they tend to open in a different location. They're open for approximately 2 months at a time, a little less. So their business will be closing again after October 31st of this year. So they'd like to have the signs for that. Staff finds that the property in question would likely yield a reasonable return without the variance. Property can be reasonably identified with signs meeting the current zoning regulations. Nature of the hardship in this case is that the applicant is not wanting to invest in permanent wall signage for a temporary business. The sign variance requested is substantial since it does allow for a request that's twice the time allowance in the code. The granting of the variance would grant a consideration that is not available to other property owners in the neighborhood. Granting of the variance would probably not have a negative impact on neighboring properties. It could, however, set a precedent for sign variances if requested by neighboring properties. Approval of the sign variance would not affect the delivery of government services. There are no topographic issues related to this property which would constrain the reasonable application of sign regulations without additional expenses. And by taking into consideration the benefits to the applicant if the variance is granted as weighed against the potential detriment to the health, safety, and welfare of the neighborhood and broader community, staff finds that substantial justice would be done by granting the variance for additional time allowance for the temporary banner sign. Staff's recommendation is actually includes adding in your motion that this be effective immediately. All of your variances, when are granted, have a 30-day referendum where staff is not actually able to issue a zoning certificate until 30 days after your approval. So staff's recommendation is actually to make the following motion: approval of the variance requested to allow for temporary signs from October 1st, 2018 to October 31st, 2018, with the decision to be effective immediately in order to meet the time constraints. I'd be happy to answer any questions the board might have of staff.
Thank you. Is the appellant here tonight? Anyone, would you like to come up and introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Wendy Smith. I'm the district sales manager for Spirit Halloween. And the store in question is the one on Colerain Avenue. It's one of my stores. And
Excuse me,
we-
Ms. Smith, before you finish, I need your signature on the form for your, at any point. Thank you. Please continue.
Our store here on Colerain is a temporary store for Spirit Halloween. We have over 1,300 stores nationwide, and we are only up for, at the end of October 31st, that is the end of our season. And we will be tearing down everything and moving out of the space. The signs are the prime advertisements for customers to be able to find our locations so that we can serve them with whatever they're interested in Halloween. We have everything from costumes to decor to makeup, you name it, we have it. And it's a wonderful company, and it's a wonderful experience, and we enjoy setting up our stores every year. And Cincinnati is a wonderful place to have these, and we luckily do have 4 of these stores this year in the Cincinnati area. So the signs are our prime way of advertising that we are here. Come and see us.
Thank you. Anyone else speak in favor? Anyone to speak in opposition? I'll ask for a motion for the public portion of this testimony to be closed.
So moved.
Second.
Motion's been made and second. Discussion. Roll call vote.
Ms. Wilson?
Aye.
Mr. Hill?
Yes.
Mr. Shupp? Mr. Bartolt?
Yes.
Mr. Reinger?
Aye. All right. Questions from the board to the applicant? Mr. Hill?
I don't have any.
No
Ms.
questions.
Wilson? Mr. Tripp? Bartolt? There are no questions from the board or the chair. At this point, I'll ask for a motion to approve or deny the request for a temporary sign. And do I have a motion?
I make a motion to approve the request for the variance,
That it be effective immediately?
effective immediately.
Motion's been made. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. Discussion? Roll call vote.
Mr. Bartolt?
Yes.
Ms. Wilson?
Aye.
Mr. Shupp?
Aye.
Mr. Hill?
Yes.
Mr. Reinger?
Aye. Thank you very much. That is approved for your sign.
We can issue that zoning certificate to you tomorrow morning.
Okay. The next case before the Board of Zoning Appeals is going to be BZA 2018-012. That's a request for change of a non-conforming use to allow processing of mulch in sales. The location is 12075 East Miami River Road. The applicant owner is Jared Handel and also Ronald Yeager. And the staff presentation, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The applicant in this case is requesting a substitution of a non-conforming use from a diesel engine and truck repair business to a mulch and firewood processing and sales operation. The applicant states that they have been doing mulch processing on the property since 2006. However, aerials of the property appear to show that in 2009, it might be about when the firewood storage began. And then with respect to aerials, we can see mulch piles first appear in 2015. I do have to note that there is a gap in the County Cages aerials. There's a gap from 2011 until 2015, so we don't see the mulch piles in 2011, but we do see them in 2015. We have some other evidence to suggest that operations started with the mulch piles in 2014 or maybe a little earlier. There was a large fire that erupted in early May of this year, and it burned for nearly a month before it was finally extinguished. That caught the attention of zoning staff to what was going on. A notice of violation was issued by zoning staff in May of 2018. We did not receive a response from that notice. A second notice of violation was issued in July of 2018 and has brought us before you this evening for this substitution request. Zoning approval had never been granted on this property. The request is for the property located, it's just west of East Miami River Road between US 27 and Old Colerain. To the north is a single-family house. To the west it is bound by the Great Miami River. To the south of this property is a gravel processing facility, and the property is bounded to the east by East Miami River Road. There are two metal shop buildings which appear to have been constructed roughly 1994, at least according to the county auditor. However, we do not have any zoning record of those structures. The property is just under 4 acres, 3.89 acres, but the applicant does appear to be working beyond those property boundaries, all entirely within the riverfront zoning district. Which is, the purpose of that district is primarily considered flood hazard areas. Really, it's used for agricultural type uses, canoe ramps, parks and recreational facilities, conservation areas. So generally, it's kind of a recreational type of zone, and single family, provided that it meet flood-proof standards. You can see that the tail end to the northeast on this property is actually within the river channel. So the blue there is FEMA floodplain, and then the hashed red lines are the current mapping of the river itself. A non-conforming use certificate was issued for the diesel engine and truck repair shop, which had been in existence prior to Colerain zoning. That use would be allowed within the B2 or the I1 zoning district. Those activities were taking place primarily within enclosed structures on the property. The mulch processing is considered a heavy industrial use, and it is allowed only in the I1 district, primarily due to the storage of flammable materials and then the excessive outdoor storage with this use. If this property were zoned as I1, it would still need BZA approval and would require significant buffering and setbacks from the existing residential. And again, the current use is expanding beyond the current property lines. Staff just wants to clarify that with respect to a non-conforming use, the general strategy is to encourage the termination of non-conforming uses and to redevelop the property for the purpose in which it's zoned. Additionally, if the board were to be looking for approval of this substitution, you should be finding that the proposed use is equally appropriate or more appropriate to the district than the existing non-conforming use. So we're looking at the engine repair, diesel and engine repair, moving to the mulch processing with all the outdoor storage. The applicant did convert from the diesel engine and truck repair business to a mulch and firewood processing sales facility without the approval of the BZA. The current operations include the chipping and shredding of wood, composting, and adding artificial dye to the mulch. Current piles are roughly 35 to 40 feet in height. The request is to continue the business as a substitution of a non-conforming use. And you can see from the aerial here, what we have on the property is in the front there, a rather dated structure. Marty, I'm sorry, this was built in 1950-ish? Is that the?
We don't know, it's a
Okay.
guess.
Okay, we're thinking that this was in the 50s, but it's definitely an aging building. You can see another structure, garage-like structure on the right of the screen there, and then obviously the significant mulch piles and with the river behind. You can also see some pretty significant outdoor storage. Most of the imagery that you'll see in this presentation is from Google Earth or County Cages due to the inability to kind of get down to that site. This is looking at the site from the other direction. You'll see towards the bottom left of the screen the large wood piles. And then again, some more outdoor storage at the top of the screen. From the right-of-way, you can see again that primary building in brown, top left, and then they have added some storage containers you can see in green, and then a small shed in green there just behind the gate. This is looking south on East Miami River Road. What you'll notice from this is kind of the encroachment into the right-of-way. This picture is taken from the right-of-way, looking further into right-of-way. I'll get to an image that'll illustrate this a little more clearly. This is then looking north on East Miami River Road, and then from across the river. You can see that there is no buffer between this use and the river. This is a street view from 2008. And I would just want to point your attention to just right of that building. We do not see any of those mulch piles, but then by 2012, we start to see those mulch piles on the site. And then here is a more current 2017 street view. And on the left of this image, you can see that the use of the property has expanded towards you in this image, blocking out. It seems to be a parking area with concrete barriers. And again, that is encroaching well into the right-of-way. In this image here, the highlighted area is right-of-way. And you can see kind of in the middle of that along the roadway, those concrete barriers that have been placed in that area. 2006 aerial, would like to point your attention to the middle of the site. See that there is there's some outdoor storage going on, but it appears to be mostly vehicles. And then by 2017, you can see that it appears as if it's some more of those concrete barriers that have been used to create bins for the mulch and other items on the property. You can see that towards the top of the site, and then also smaller bins to the bottom of the site near that main entryway, driveway. This is a site plan that the applicant provided to us. It is not to scale. It does, though, I think, illustrate how tight this site is to operate, especially with respect to firefighting activities. Again, I want to point out that in May of this year, there was a very significant fire on this property. I spoke with Chief Frank Cook of the Colerain Fire Department, and he did provide a letter, a memo to me, which was included in your board packets. The one thing that I wanted to point out from his memo, he stated that since May of 2014, the Department of Fire and EMS has responded to 19 fire incidences related to the mulch and composting processing and storage operation at 12075 East Miami River Road. Additionally, Chief Cook provided me with some more detail about those operations. He provided me a list of 19 incidents. One of those listed as off-road vehicle or heavy equipment fire. 9 of those listed as natural vegetation fire or other. 3 brush or brush and grass mixture fires, 1 construction or demolition landfill fire, 1 outside storage fire, and 4 cultivated trees or nursery stock fires. Additionally, I have a letter that was also included in your packet from Chief Steve Miller of the Ross Township Fire Department. Ross Township does provide mutual aid to Colerain Township and vice versa when it becomes necessary. Chief Miller stated in his letter that their response to the incident actually took one of their fire stations out of service due to their personnel assisting extinguishing this particular fire. He noted that this is not the first time that they had responded to this location, and specifically noted October 22nd of 2017, where they assisted in extinguishing a large mulch fire in the same location. And then the last item that I wanted to point out from Chief Miller's letter was that he personally feels that these fires could have been prevented if the occupant would have had a better management practice of dealing with bulk mulch piles. Additionally, I do know that Chief Cook and I discussed that there were traffic issues associated with all of the smoke from this fire up on US 27. The fire department, the Colerain Fire Department, also received notification from the waterworks because they were concerned about a significant drop in water reserve levels while this fire was being fought. So they actually called the fire department asking what's going on, wanted to make sure that they weren't going to run out of water. We have reached out to the EPA because it's our understanding that there may be some stormwater retention issues with the site, but I don't have any confirmation of that. Also reached out to Greg Smorey with Hamilton County. He is the floodplain manager, but I have not yet received any notification back from him on that as well. I do have Captain Mark Walsh here tonight as part of this staff presentation. He is with the Colerain Fire Department, and he can speak more specifically about the challenges with firefighting operations on this site. Captain Walsh?
Good afternoon. For the record, it's Mark Walsh, Captain with Colerain Fire Department. Janet from zoning had asked me to address the board tonight with some of the other issues that we've had down there, and just trying to give you a Reader's Digest version. We've actually had issues down here since 2009 when he started his tree service business down here with open burn complaints. In some of those cases, the fire department was not needed to respond. Either we had the individuals report them out or put them out while we were down here. But in some of those cases, it did become confrontational because we've had to have the sheriff's department respond down here to us. Over the period of time, the property has gained more and more waste, if we want to call it, or mulch. And up to this point, the fire department does not have any access back there. The challenge we had this day was limited access to the back sides of those mulch piles to put it out. Outside of using personnel, water, and the contamination into the waterway, was getting our personnel back there to fully affect or try to control this fire. And it was stated we were there, I think, over 30 days plus at that site. I'm not too sure what else I can provide to the board, but if you've got any questions, I'll be more to ask. Right now, his site does not conform with some of the fire code where it talks about access. His pile limits based on the fire code are no more than 25 feet high, typically about 150 feet wide or long, with an approved fire department access around all those pile areas, which we do not have. Some of his property or his mulch piles sit, I believe that is Watson's or who's his neighbor? I can't remember the neighbor over there. That's right on that property line, so it's not access. We cannot gain access to the other side of the property to officially fight the fire. So for us, it's been a hindrance. He's been there since 2008, since he started releasing the property. And basically, we're down here several times throughout the year addressing the same issues over and over again. So,
Okay. Thank you.
okay.
Appreciate it.
Staff still has, just want to again remind you, when it comes to the substitution of a non-conforming use, you are looking for an equally appropriate or more appropriate use for the district than the existing non-conforming use, which again is that diesel and truck repair. Staff findings, first, that the non-conforming use change requested is substantial, since the mulch processing and firewood storage and sales tends to be more intensive use than diesel engine and truck repair. 2, the granting of the non-conforming certificate would likely have a more adverse impact on the surrounding neighborhood than the previous business, since it involves extensive outdoor storage, outdoor equipment operations, and processing of a flammable material. The washing of mulch dye, and the firewood into the Great Miami River during severe rain or flood events could cause water pollution and a hazardous condition during an emergency. 3, the property in question would likely yield a reasonable return without the change of non-conforming use. It could have continued as a diesel engine and truck repair business or any other permitted use within the riverfront zoning district. 4, the nature of the business with extensive outdoor storage of loose mulch chips, potentially hazardous dyes, and firewood in the floodplain of the Great Miami River is not compatible, since the materials could easily be washed into the river in a flood event. 5, approval of the change will affect the delivery of government services. Colerain Fire Department has expended substantial resources to extinguish fires at this property on numerous occasions. And 6, by taking into consideration the benefit to the applicant if the change is granted, as weighed against the potential detriment to the health, safety, and welfare of the neighborhood and broader community, staff finds that substantial justice would be done by not allowing the change of use. Staff's recommendation is denial of the request for change of non-conforming use.
Okay. Thank you. Is the appellant here? Please, if you would, if you wish to address the board. Please state your name and address.
We have been there since 2006. We were selling wood chips at a much smaller scale. Mulch was a little bit later on. It says right here, property owned, primarily permits agricultural and recreational use. We are an agricultural commodity, so we're part of the forestry and timber industry. There is at least 20 that I can kind of know. Agro, Alvis, Browns up in Hamilton, everybody that I know that's in the mulch business is right along the Great Miami River. It is a, when I started renting the ground from Ron Yeager back in '06, there was, he said it was zoned light industrial because our neighbors right next door to us is Watson's Gravel. Much larger, much heavier equipment, a lot more semis coming and going out there. So I don't know how it goes from a riverfront agricultural recreational use to where we're right next to industrial people. And then Ron Yeager also said that it changed from light industrial to the small shop. He wasn't even aware of it when we started renting it out. We've never had any issues. I've never heard of, I'll tell you, 19 incidences of fire instances false. I mean, they might come down there a couple times a year. It's more about being right next to 27 than actually needing the fire department. Since then, the main issue is we just let other people dump, so the pile got a lot probably bigger than we normally would have let it been. We've not let people dump since then. One of our competitors started charging, and then the whole world started coming to our dump back in 17, so our dump was a little bit bigger than we normally would let it be. But we do feel that we are doing agricultural commodity in a flood area. We are making mulch. That we color the mulch. It's safe because we are coloring. I mean, mulch is around everybody's house. It's a water-based product. There's nothing unsafe with that. I mean, we've been selling firewood there since 2006. So I just think that it's not fair that we're having this kind of a financial burden to not be, we pay money for this ground, good money for the ground, and then we're getting regulated on what we're doing. We're not up here on Colerain Avenue, by Colerain Avenue in Springdale. We're at the very northern tip of the county. It's kind of rural. I have a large gravel company behind me, or to the left of me, and to the right of me, I've got somebody that lives in a trailer. So it's not even like a house. My neighbors, there's one person who lives on top of the home. Everything else is Fairfield, 10 minutes down the road, and Ross is across the river. So I'm not in a subdivision. I don't have subdivisions across the street. I don't have subdivisions to my right, to my left. Ron Yeager did build the building back in the 50s, and before the zoning was even an issue. So I do think that we should be grandfathered in because there shouldn't be there. I am okay, obviously, with making sure it's a safe environment. For firefighting capabilities, they were able to always go on the left side when they did come from the left. When we did have that fire issue, I'm the one who was running the dozer, which is the main machine that helped put it out. I mean, obviously you need your firefighters to cool down, but it's all about just getting the earthworking equipment in there. We took the mountain, we brought it down to size. We've not had a fire since May. We just had a real dry spell, and we had the winds whip up and stuff like that. And we had some new mulch there that was just from a lumber yard that was a drier content. Most of our treated material is much towards 30% moisture content. We had some drier stuff in there that was right next to our neighbor. That was like a rock wall. We think there was just some wind picking up some lime and stuff like that. But I think the main thing from what I've learned with mulch fires is you got to stay below a certain amount of height, and you don't have issues. We have not watered this pile since the end of May. There's been no fire issues. I really think I'm here for a fire issue, and not really that we're doing anything wrong other than that. There's agricultural fires in hay buildings. There's a skyline that just burnt down just because you have one major fire. Obviously, we'd have any issues. If we've had 19 issues with fire departments, this is the last one was obviously a real issue. But we've never had to be here before. So you get a big fire, then all of a sudden we're here. Things do happen, but it doesn't mean that you should just shut down what we're doing because of it. I think there's a lot of improvements we talked about doing, and I think it's all about not letting anybody other than my company dump there, and also making sure we keep the height below. I think 35 feet is what I wrote down. And there's really, as long as we keep the height down, and we don't let anybody else dump there but us, I don't think we're going to have any issues. And then I just think, I'm right next to, Watson's Gravel, and it seems like you guys are choosing winners and losers. I mean, I don't know how I can be next to a gravel pit, but, and he's zoned industrial, then I'm considered small shop, and we're not allowed to do it.
Anyone else? Thank you, Mr. Handler. Anyone else speak in favor? Anyone to speak in opposition? If there's no one else speak in favor or in opposition to this case, I'll ask for a motion to close the public portion of the hearing.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, motion's been made and seconded. Roll call vote, please.
Ms. Wilson?
Aye.
Mr. Bartelt?
Yes.
Mr. Shep?
Aye.
Mr. Hill?
Yes.
Mr. Reinger?
Aye. We'll now begin with the board questions, and we'll start with Mr. Hill.
I do have a question for the applicant. If you can step back up to the podium, please. Come up to the podium, please. You indicated that you began leasing the property in 2006. Is that correct? At the time that you started leasing the property, did you contact the township to see whether or not your use was permitted, or did you make any attempts to figure out whether or not you could even do what you wanted to do on the property prior to actually operating?
I was younger in 2006, and I didn't realize how much red tape you could get through things. There was already somebody there that was splitting firewood that had a smaller scale of firewood, and he didn't. And Ron always said we were zone light industrial, and because you're zone light industrial, and when you're next to a gravel pit, and you're not next to, a real pretty mall or shopping mall, I just thought we were always allowed to do it, because back in my prior thoughts, you're either agricultural, you're commercial, or you're residential. I didn't know about different variances of commercial, so.
That's our question.
Ms. Wilson, can we come back to you?
Yes, please.
Mr. Shoup?
Yes, I have one question. You mentioned that the dye that you use is a food dye?
It's water-based. All dye that you use with mulch, it's a water-based product. They wouldn't let you, nobody uses oil. Even paint's going to water-based, but it's a water-based dye it's friendly. Everybody, everybody that you buy your mulch from is all next to water. We're all next to water because it takes water to color mulch. It takes water if you do have fire issues to put it down. It also you use water to accelerate the breakdown process. So anybody who sells mulch in the greater Cincinnati area, Evans, Irvin, everybody's all next to the Little or Great Miami River.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
No.
Mr. Bartle?
Yeah, just a couple. First one for staff. You mentioned this could occur in the I-1 district. Refresh my memory. I'm assuming there are some I-1s in the township somewhere. I'm just curious, like, where that might be.
There are, I believe, let me pull up a countywide map very quickly. Many of them are up near the Rumpke development. And there are some near, I believe, the Harrison Avenue corridor there, 275 Harrison Avenue.
And do we know if there are any mulch establishments in the township presently, other than his?
I don't have the answer to that question, no.
Okay. I mean, if there were, they would have to be in those districts.
Correct.
I mean, he's rattled off, or he lists about, 8 or 9, but I don't know if any of them are actually in the township.
I don't believe now, Marty Kohler did kind of take a look through these that the applicant had noted. And it appears that while all of these are along a riverway, they are not within or exclusively within the floodplain itself. This particular property is exclusively within the floodplain. In fact, I don't believe, and Marty, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe that Marty found any of these to have any of their outdoor storage or mulch actually in the floodplain.
Okay, all right.
As far as these types of operations go, it's my understanding that this is actually a pretty tight site at just under 4 acres.
Yeah, and to the point, previously, like if you were to build a new building, typically you have to have a 20 to 30-foot clearance around the building so that fire trucks can get around. Your mulch pile is not a building, but similar problem if you have a fire. There's no good access around it. So even if you were allowed to stay there, I would assume per the township you would be required to have that 20 to 30-foot access around it. So I don't even know if that, by doing that, if that leaves enough square footage to even have a mulch pile.
It does because we have a second lot. I mean, we're going to be a lot smaller mulch. There wasn't the money we thought in it way before the fire. So we're just not letting anybody else dump. And we do have another facility where we had to move to just to park our tree trucks. So, I'm okay with us, with the restrictions, make sure the fire department people get in or in the back edges. To me, it's more about height. Height is where all the fire stuff's at. So this is a learning curve for me than anything because we haven't watered it since then. We've not had any fire issues. But once you start getting 35 plus feet, the heat starts to get so hot, and then mulch fires. We never had the tall fire was never an issue, but the new stuff we ground that was dry caught the big pile of fire, and because it was so big, so tall, that's what made it hard to fight. I don't like how the firefighter was put out the fire. I wish they would have got in there a little bit deeper, a little bit higher. When I was on the dozer wearing the oxygen mask, and they told me to throw it off the back end, but really I wanted to dump it more away, and they never really got in until the fire kind of already got going. I know it's just kind of a tough spot. It's kind of chaos when you're dealing with that. But I've been there. I've never seen a fire like that. It was just we had real windy days, early April, real sustained 25-mile-an-hour winds, and it was just it's like a perfect storm.
And when you said others are dumping, explain.
I used to let other companies dump at our place.
Dump mulch?
Dump brush or wood chips. So because the other companies were dumping brush and wood, it would get kind of all combobulated. If you looked at our other site's just pure wood chips because it's just us dumping. Pure wood chips is a lot more easier to manage and dump. And if I had I had a dozer, which significantly helped out with the fire, but if I'd have had an excavator, you know what I'm saying, we could have just pulled it right out. So we did have a dozer, it did help out. It was just amazing. It was just a challenging time for us to put out the fire, but it wasn't a normal issue. Like I said, we haven't watered it at all since the end of May. So 3 weeks after the fire started, we've never watered it, but we did knock it down. And I Googled, I went online, and it said if you get the height down, below 30 feet, you're not going to have any issues, and we haven't had any issues since.
All right, thanks. No other questions?
Ms. Wilson?
I do have a few questions. First, I just want to be sure I heard you correctly. You were not aware of the other fires where the fire department was called to your property?
They've been there maybe a couple times a year. It's not that we need them. It's about being on 27. So if anybody sees anything on 27 coming from Butler County to Colerain County, people call anybody. I built one fire when I was first there in like 06 or something. We had some brush and we burned it. I've never had a set fire since then because Colerain came down, you can't burn anything. I'm used to Butler County where you can.
Okay, so you're saying that the fire department did not respond to your property 19 times?
No, that's an exaggerated number.
Okay.
And if they did come here 19 times, why didn't I come here the first or second time?
Were you actually the person operating on the property, or were you leasing during the time? When were you the actual person operating your business?
But we were smaller than mulch then, so the piles, they're not going to pull up great on Google Earth. We were just selling our own wood chips.
Okay, so only in 06 and 08 you were actually on the property yourself, and then you leased
Yes.
other times?
We've been there since 08. We were more firewood in the beginning. More firewood. It was a firewood sales. We stored our firewood logs, and we used to dump at Alvis and Agro because I didn't have a tub grinder or access to grinding. And it was about 2010-ish. We started keeping our mulch, and we started selling mulch.
Okay.
It didn't get a lot bigger till around 17 when we started letting other people dump. That's when it got a lot more bigger
Okay.
pile.
And as far as, I think I just heard you say that you Googled appropriate height for the piles. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's a national paper that everybody reads in the mulch business. And mulch fires are very prevalent throughout. I mean, there was a big one in Tennessee, but they just talked about the height. It's all about the height. If you can't roll it over, it's all about keeping the height below a certain level because it never gets as hot.
Okay, and then are you the person who wrote the response to the second notice?
Yes.
Okay, and so I see in here that you listed a number of measures that you all planned on putting in place or have already put in place. How you said only the height is addressed in this document that you referred to. How did you come to the conclusion of these measures? What are they based on?
If you can remind me, I couldn't find it because we had to move.
It starts with a paragraph. There was not any problem with what Ross Mulch was doing till devastating fire happened in April 2018. The fire was a learning event for both Ross Mulch and Colerain Fire Department. Does everybody know where I'm reading from? Okay. I'm sorry, I should have checked first. And the Colerain Fire Department listed below is ways we plan to mitigate any future issues, and listed below Colerain Township can enforce these restrictions on Ross Mulch. A, make sure we don't put any mulch on the west side of the property touching concrete wall seams. The concrete wall holds heat, and we have never had issues when Ross Mulch was not touching the wall. B, make sure the height of the mulch pile does not exceed 35 to 40 feet, and I understand you got that from that document that you found online. Wood chip mountain holds too much heat and can help fires start or be hard to put out. C, measure the temperature of the pile every 2 weeks and make sure it's under 140 degrees. If not, move pile or water pile. D, since this fire, we now have three 3-inch pumps and two 2-inch pumps, and I'm not for sure what that means. E, if we freshly tub grind, I mean, it just goes on. Do you?
Those are things we were gonna do, yeah.
Okay. And how did you all come up with these measures? Like, what are they based on?
There was a guy that did our tub grinding with the new pile, and he's just really old, and he's done it forever, and he's the one that told us about what to do.
So just a suggestion.
And then these are things kind of after the fact too. You learn more about how to try to stop it
Okay.
after the fact, after the fire. You know more after than before.
Okay.
And in the wall, I think our fires, of any fires we've ever had, have always been small. They've always been along the wall. There's a big concrete wall between me and my gravel neighbor because the gravel kept coming over, and we think the wall gets hot and the lime from the wall, because he's a gravel pit, comes over, and we think that's what does stuff. So if we never let our big pile of mulch ever touch that concrete wall, we've never had any real issues.
Okay. And I'm very concerned about the lack of the setback is from the river, as well as. Am I correct? There's not enough setback from the river and the front, the right of way. What are your plans to prevent? I mean, I'm very concerned about pollution in that regard. I mean, it looks like you all have no barriers or anything like that on top of not having an appropriate setback. How are you all going to address that?
Well, we don't go past the river, past it, so we normally do have some type of, like, about, doesn't look great from the sky, but there's normally about at least a bobcat width from it. Our gravel neighbors, I mean, they're right there on the edge, so they don't. So I guess because it's a natural product, I go boating on the high river, and anytime it goes above 35 feet, you always see logs and brush run around, so it's a wood product. So from an environmental standpoint, I mean, I think it was kind of sabotage. They ever called the EPA because it's just wood. But it was.
You said it's wood that's dyed, correct?
No, but the dyed stuff was always up front. All our dyed products up front, so we're ready to sell. That is totally encased because I don't ever want to lose the dye, because if it rains too much, I roll it over. So we never lose our dye.
So are you saying
what I'm
that
talking about is our wood chips.
any wood that goes in there is just chips that did not get produced or whatnot? It's
In the
just
river?
waste. I'm saying you're saying that there's a bobcat. You're talking about a truck, like a tractor.
10 foot. There is a 10-foot barrier between us
Okay.
and the berm that goes down.
So you're saying if there is any wood that gets into the river, it's just plain old wood, not dyed wood?
Yes.
Okay.
The only thing we dye is mulch, and our mulch is totally encased in 4-foot high brick, because I'm not worried about the river floating up. I just want to always roll it over, so you never lose the dye.
Okay. And then my final question is, what are your plans to make the, I don't know if you submitted any plans, but to make the site more accessible to the fire department?
I mean,
It's very concerning that it took 30 days for a fire to get put out.
we can make sure they can get on the we can give them paths. We're going to be a lot smaller. That pile's never going to be that big ever again.
So you don't have any actual plans, like, actually in place right now, or?
We would just have to talk to them. I've been dealing with this, so I mean, you don't go up there and poke a bear unless you need to. So we've not had any fire issues since then, but we could. The main thing is just having a path in the middle. But when they were there, we made them a path, and they still didn't want to drive up there. I mean, there was a path they could have came in farther and more aggressive, and they were worried about it being flat enough, and we made it flat. I mean, some very simple things is just get some fire hydrants back there, and we'd be willing to cover that cost, so there would be no issues with that if they thought. I think fire extinguisher is probably the easiest. I mean, if they came up with solutions, we'll come up with it. Either fire extinguishers or a path.
I don't have any other questions.
If you'd care to stay there, I've got perhaps a question, but more comments than questions. You had based some of your rationale on the agricultural commodity that wood is. That's called a CAUV, I believe, designation. Is that a designation you elect, or does the county auditor designate or certify a CAUV product or area? And that may be a question for you, sir, or maybe a question for staff. Is the county auditor the one who sets a CAUV designation?
They do, and there is no COV value on this particular property. There is no COV value on this property.
Okay. So, then, sir, what you believe is an agricultural commodity isn't an agricultural commodity if it's not a CAUV certified by the county auditor. I have a concern that you're operating in a zone that is not zoned for the type of use you've got. You mentioned grandfathering. If you were doing diesel repair, that I guess would be more of a possibility than switching from diesel repair to mulch processing. There's a contentious issue between yourself and the fire department. The fire department is saying 14 runs or 19 fire incidences since 2014. And what is your estimate? How many times have you had the fire department out there if you don't think their numbers are correct?
I mean, not much more than a couple times a year. And we've had them where they weren't there at all. That one year we didn't touch the wall, they didn't have them at all.
So, then my follow-up question to that is the learning curve. If it's only a couple times a year, how many times a year does it take to eliminate that need entirely? I mean, when does the learning curve start? After the third fire, the fourth fire, the seventh fire, the 10th fire? At what point do you then decide to change your management practices?
Well, we stopped letting people dump after this fire. So, I mean, it was just something major happened in our market that another competitor started charging to dump. Now everybody charges to dump. So, I mean, one time we couldn't even dump there because there was that many people dumping. And then I knew we had to do something. And then, so, I mean, we just stopped people from dumping. But then the pile was really big and then they caught a fire. So, this was the only fire that I've ever needed them at, was the last one. Okay. So when they come there, they're generally small. We do have the pumps. We've always been able to put it out. The fire department has to do their job. If somebody sees anything on 27, if there's any smoke at all, it does not take much. I could go in your backyard and they have enough smoke with some leaves. If you're on by 27, everybody's just driving to work. It does not take much for people to call you. It does not take much smoke.
There's an issue about property line setback. If you set back all of your operations 100 feet from the adjoining property lines, it's going to really compress your site. I think you mentioned you're right up against the gravel operation. You're actually in the right-of-way on East Miami River Road. And I don't know how you can effectively operate with and stay in compliance. I really don't. That and the fact that you've never been permitted on that site. Diesel operation, granted, that's in there, but you're not expanding a diesel operation, you're expanding something totally different. I think that closes my comments at this point. If there's any other questions from the board to the applicant. All right, thank you, sir. You may sit down. If there are no questions, I'll ask for a motion to approve or deny the request for non-conforming use to allow processing of mulch and sales.
I'll make a motion to deny the request for the variance for the change of non-conforming use.
Okay. There is a motion on the floor to deny the request for non-conforming use. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Motion's been made and seconded. Is further discussion from the board?
I just have a comment.
Comment?
I understand being young and being new. I think many of us who are business owners have been there and done that, but maybe this is occupational hazard for me as an attorney, but my advice to you is to always check first to see if there's any sort of zoning or regulations or laws that would govern whatever you're trying to do. I appreciate what you're saying about you didn't know, but unfortunately, if something happens and you find yourself in court, a judge is going to tell you ignorance of the law is not a defense. So it's just my humble suggestion to you to just, as you go forward, really make sure you do your due diligence and your research before you move forward with any sort of project or business, etc. That's just all I have to say.
Okay. Any other discussion? Okay, I'll ask for a roll call vote. And an aye means that the request to deny is approved.
Mr. Hill,
Yes.
Mr. Shep?
Aye.
Mr. Bartolt?
Yes.
Ms. Wilson?
Aye.
Mr. Reinger?
Aye. Thank you. The next case in front of our board tonight is BZA 2018-013. It's a request for a variance for accessory structure from section 10.2.3, section 10.2.1, bracket A, bracket 9, and section 10.2.3, bracket B. Location is 2775 Wilson Avenue, and the applicant owner is Henry Ray Smith. Staff presentation, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The subject property is located at the southeast corner of Wilson Avenue and New Market. In July, specifically July 17th of 2018, a notice of violation was issued for the construction of an accessory structure without a zoning permit. At the time of this violation, in addition to the new structure that was going up, there were additional accessory structures on the property. On this particular property, there would be a total allowance of 547 square feet of accessory structure. This building alone, the building in question is 432 square feet. Again, at the time, there were additional accessory structures on the property. It's my understanding that those have since been removed. So the notice of violation with respect to too much lot coverage appears to have been resolved. On July 26th, 2018, the applicant came in to apply for a zoning certificate for an 18 by 24 accessory structure with a height of 13 feet 10 inches and 2 feet from the property line. On July 31st, 2018, zoning staff issued a letter of refusal for lot coverage. The fact that the structure was proposed to be taller than the house and that it was too close to the property line. Again, that lot coverage issue has been since resolved. The applicant claims that there were 2 errors made by staff with respect to lot coverage and height. Again, lot coverage has been resolved. However, the site measurement, the on-site measurement of the height found that the accessory structure stands 6 feet taller than the primary structure. I'm sorry, inches,
6
not
inches.
feet. Sorry, 6 inches. Thank you. Quite a difference. I just want to point your attention to section 10.2.3b, where it specifically discusses accessory buildings and structures in residential districts shall have a maximum height of 15 feet, but in no case shall the accessory building or structure exceed the height of the principal building. So in this particular case, the applicant's height of the accessory structure is below that 15-foot maximum. However, the way that it is situated on the property, it is taller than the primary structure. And then, of course, the next section of the code, which requires the structure to be 5 feet from all lot lines. Looking at the site here, you can see large accessory structures that were removed from the site, from this aerial. These are images that were taken on July 17th, 2018 by our code enforcement officer upon complaint from a neighboring property owner. At that time, the property owner was issued an NOV and told to stop construction of the structure. But I can tell you that this is an image taken just last week. So the work did continue from that point. I want to point out in this particular image, and I'm not sure I fully understand why this is the case. Possibly the applicant can speak to this, but this structure is still mounted up on what appears to be kind of a block structure, 2 feet from the property line, and adding that additional 6 inches of height. Another image of what that looks like along the property line. And then the image on the right from in the driveway. Aerial view, it's a little tough to see, but in the bottom right corner of the property the aerial shows the former shed structures. And this is the approximate location of the new structure. The applicant did provide this site plan. I apologize, this is now flipped upside down from what we were just looking at with the house to the top of your screen there. These were the previous sheds. And then here would be the new shed. I do want to point out on this image that the applicant does have a double driveway at approximately, I believe it's about 20 feet wide in the front of the property, the front yard of the property. That driveway, 10 feet wide, so a single lane driveway does extend along the side of the house adjacent to the shed. The structure that has been constructed without a zoning permit sits 18 feet from the primary residence. To meet code, this would need to move 3 feet to the right, still allowing for 15 feet between the primary structure and the shed structure. Elevation drawings provided by the applicant showing the height of 13 feet 9 inches from the peak of the roof to grade. And this is where I would like to point out that typically when we are measuring the height of an accessory structure, we are measuring that midpoint between the peak of the roof and the height of the walls. This structure does, again, come under that 15-foot maximum requirement for accessory structures. However, it comes down to how this is situated on the property and that it does stand approximately 6 inches taller than the primary structure. This is a structure that would require a building permit through the Hamilton County Building Department because it is greater than 200 square feet. It is my understanding that the applicant does not have a building permit. Typically, the building department will not even review an application for a building permit until the applicant has secured a zoning certificate. The height of the variance requested is substantial since the proposed building exceeds the maximum height by about 6 inches. Proposed minimum rear yard setback is 2 feet. Of 2 feet is substantial since it's 60% reduction from the required 5 feet. The granting of the variance would grant a consideration that is not available to other property owners in the neighborhood. Property in question would likely yield a reasonable return without the variance. The property can reasonably be used as a single-family dwelling within the limits of the zoning resolution. The granting of the variance would probably have a negative impact on neighboring properties due to the height and close proximity to the neighboring property line. Approval of the height and setback variance would not affect the delivery of government services. There are no unusual topographic or site configuration issues related to this property which would prevent the reasonable application of the height and setback regulations. And by taking into consideration the benefit to the applicant, the variance is granted as weighed against the potential detriment to the health, safety, and welfare of the neighborhood and broader community. Staff finds that substantial justice would be done by not granting the variance for additional height and reduced setback for an accessory building. Staff's recommendation is denial of the variance requests, and I'd be happy to answer any questions the board might have of staff at this time.
Any immediate
Just
questions?
one. The measurement of the new building and the existing house, that was done by going on their property and actually measuring?
That was. Mr. Kohler went out to the site, and he did not go through, there was a locked gate on the property. He did not go through that locked gate, so he measured the accessory structure from outside of that gate, and then he measured the primary structure actually from the other side of the house.
With
a tape measure from the peak of the roof to grade.
But even though you couldn't physically get to the accessory structure, you just kind of eyeballed it, or? Well, the accessory structure he's saying is what it is, but I guess the house, you were right up against the house, and, okay.
And the accessory structure is right up against the fence.
Oh, okay. So you were able to measure that, okay.
Any other questions for staff? If not, is the appellant here, applicant, and would they care to make any comments about the case?
I'm Mike Bergman. I'm the attorney for the applicant, who is Henry Smith. Mr. Smith is joining me here. Perhaps.
I'm sorry, my hearing is not so good. Could you give me your name, please?
Yes, my name is Mike Bergman. I'm an attorney here in the area, and I am representing Henry Smith, the applicant.
Have you signed in?
Okay, have you signed in?
Do you need both Mr. Smith and me to sign in?
Yes.
Okay, because I won't be testifying.
If you're going to speak, I
I'll be speaking.
need you to sign in. I think, Mr. Smith, you already signed in, didn't you? Okay. Thank you. Thank you. All right, and who is going to do who will do the presentation?
I'll be heading the presentation, Mr. Chairman. If I could, I'd like to be a little bit old school. I don't have the benefit of the projector, if you will, but I do have some handouts, if that's all right.
Sure. Let the record reflect that the board's been giving handouts illustrating the property in question, as well as several surrounding properties. Proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, as I said before, my name is Mike Bergman, and I'm here on behalf of Mr. Smith. I guess first and foremost, what I want to do on behalf of Mr. Smith and his wife is apologize to the zoning department. Apparently, when the letter of violation was originally sent, a young man who is not yet a member of the family, but is soon to join the family, decided to go to speak to the folks at the zoning department and speak about a letter of violation that had been received by Mr. Smith. And apparently he was somewhat loud and boisterous and perhaps inappropriate. I think it may have gotten things off on the wrong foot. I'm certain that it probably caused some upset. I want to apologize on behalf of the Smith family for that.
Okay.
So thank you. Mr. Smith is seeking to obtain the issuance of a zoning certificate so that an accessory building can be built in an area that is in the southeastern quadrant of his lot. And as a matter of fact, I hesitate to do this to interrupt the flow of things, but I would like to provide another handout if I may. This may be something that
All right, and let the record reflect we have another diagram defining corner lots, rear lots, front yard, and it's a generic presentation. Okay.
What I'll present to the panel is that this particular depiction is actually figure 12.2 from the zoning ordinance. This actually comes right out of the document, and I'm providing it to you because with respect to the first document that I provided to you showing that the Smith's property is a corner lot, this next document lays the foundation for the third document that I'll be providing.
Okay, and we have a third document also labeled 12.2 corner lots. This one has it's a
here.
This reading.
Oh, okay, side property line. Okay, it's got measurements on it.
Correct. Now, the three documents are meant collectively to provide some illustration of the following. That first, the Smith's property is a corner lot. That secondly, this is a corner lot to which basically section 12.2 of the zoning ordinance would be applicable. And the third document is actually an application of measurements that are contained within the, pertaining to the Smith's lot, but also obtained from the building plan that had been previously projected by the staff. And if one would take a look at the third document, specifically the one that has the measurements on it, it reflects an area where you see in dotted, kind of a dotted rectangular depiction of an accessory building. And to the extent that this document is reflective of the Smith's property, the accessory building would be located in the vicinity of this particular dotted rectangle. And the dimension of that building is 18 by 24, I believe. As you can see, at least in the depiction, it falls within this area that's been designated as the rear yard. Now, in filing the zoning appeal, you know, what the Smiths had to go on was a letter of refusal, a notice of refusal that was provided by the zoning department. And in that particular letter, it was asserted that given the circumstances of the Smith's yard, they were entitled to have a building of no more than 161 square feet, as opposed to a building of more than 400 square feet. That is the one that is the subject of tonight's presentation. In attempting to ascertain where that 161 foot designation came from, I learned from the zoning department that they had a different interpretation of the zoning ordinance than what was reflected in section 12.2. So I attempted to provide some background and support for the position of my client that the size of his building and the location of the building was indeed appropriate. Attempted to do it on a number of occasions and was unable to obtain any kind of reconciliation of what was, to me, the plain language of section 12.2 and the circumstances here. Ultimately, we had to file the appeal in order to try to resolve this problem. And even at that point, we had no indication from the staff that, in fact, there would be some recognition of the approach that we were taking. It was only when we received the staff report that we find recited in the staff report exactly the same presentation and interpretation of section 12.2 that we had taken all along. And it was at that particular point in time that we're presented with the fact that we have asserted in our appeal that there was indeed an error by the zoning department relating to the subject of whether this was an appropriate size building and an appropriate location. And when I say location, I'm not speaking specifically of the setback, but more specifically relating to the location of the building in what is designated as the rear yard. It was kind of interesting that I found in talking with the zoning department that they said that they had been interpreting this section 12.2 in a different fashion from what they're presenting tonight all along, and that my presentation was somehow a novel approach. A little bit disconcerting. We had hoped that this was something that did not have to expend at the time of the parties who are involved with this case in order to try to reach this resolution. But ultimately, we are where we are today, and that is that, if I understand the staff's position correctly, they are now accepting that the building that my client would have in this particular area and what's designated as the rear yard, the size of the building and the location are in fact correct. That a building of that size can be in that rear yard area. And that, from what I understand, the staff has no issue with that.
That's correct.
All right. So then we came to the second point, and that was with respect to the height of this particular structure. In the violation, I might mention, there was no mention whatsoever of the height of the structure. When my client received notice of the violation, no indication in that particular notification that there was any problem with the height. When the notice of refusal came, however, the next step, we see for the first time some reference. And in that reference, it says, not that there's a variation of 6 inches, not that there's any measurement difference whatsoever. It's that it appears that there may be a height difference between the structures. Very difficult to try to respond to something where it's a person's subjective observation, perhaps. There was no indication in the letter of any evidence that was had. There was in the letter, no evidence of any measurement. There was really no evidence of any basis for the denial on the basis of this alleged height difference. And then last of all, we came to the only item for which it appeared that we would need to ask for a variance, and that was with respect to the fact that this particular property was 2 feet, where it's situated 2 feet from the property line versus 5 feet from the property line. And that particular point was something that is ultimately to be the further subject of this evening, and as we get down the road a little bit here. But as far as the second item, the one relating to the height, again, going back to the language of the denial, it was no information was submitted regarding the building height with the application, but it appears that the building may exceed the height of the house. As I said before, there was no actual measurement mentioned, no evidence cited. There was not even a request for any additional information or a request to measure the property before the application for the zoning certificate was denied. Prior to this appeal, the filing of this appeal and the issuance of the staff report, I attempted to obtain through telephone conferences with the zoning department the opportunity to submit and have considered additional information relating to the height for the purpose of resolving this particular item, because if there was no height difference, we wouldn't need to be taking up the time of the board this evening. It wouldn't be a basis for denying the zoning certificate. In fact, I could get no response to that request. In fact, I was asked to simply defer that for this board's consideration. The first time that I learned that the staff had any measurements whatsoever pertaining to the accessory building and to the house was from the staff report which I received a few days ago. In that report, it stated that the house was 13 feet 4 inches high and the accessory building was 13 feet 10 inches high. I followed up with the zoning director, attempting to find out what were the circumstances that these measurements were taken and what methodology was used. And frankly, I was told that that would have to require some inquiry of some other resource. So I followed up with Mr. Kohler. Mr. Kohler advised me that he took the measurement of the house on the right or west side of the house, which runs along Newmarket. The measurement from the peak to the ground was taken with a tape measure, and that he was measuring that on his own without any ladder or assistance from any other person. It is worth noting that there is a 4-inch high flower bed along the entire west or right side of the property. Thus, Mr. Kohler's measurement of the flower bed level was 4 inches shorter than the true ground level of the home, which could have been measured anywhere else, and particularly could have been measured anywhere else had he simply requested that the Smiths allow him to do so. What's also interesting about that, by the way, is that the ridge of the house, which sits back a few inches from the peak of the house. The ridge actually adds a couple of inches to the house itself, so that if one actually measured from basically the top of the ridge to the ground, one would be looking at and added in the 4 inches, if you will, for the flower bed that were not a part of that measurement. You'd be adding 6 inches to the total height of the house, which would put it at approximately 13 feet 10 inches. The measurement that had been reported that we attempted to have considered by the zoning department was that the house was 13 feet 9 inches, and that we'd also found that the accessory building had a similar height. It's not a similar, an identical height. Now, he also measured, Mr. Kohler also advised me that he measured the accessory building from a vantage point outside the fence at the top of the applicant's driveway. I don't know if you recall looking at one of the photographs earlier, but it shows the fence running across the driveway, and the accessory building is on the other side of that fence. Once again, had Mr. Kohler asked for an opportunity to enter the fence, he certainly would have been allowed to do so. However, he didn't. Instead, he measured the fence, or measured the building from the fence. The fence sits 2 feet from the property line, or not the property line, the fence line there. The fence is 6 feet high. So it was under these circumstances, 6-foot-high fence, building 2 feet beyond that Mr. Kohler, although I'll acknowledge the building does have some overhang, but in fact it's under these circumstances that Mr. Kohler says, or will say, and at least reported to me, that he took this measurement. And the measurement that he came up with under those circumstances was 13 feet 10 inches. Still, after this discussion, no resolution of that before tonight's hearing. Instead, what the staff has recommended to the board is that, by golly, you should find that there's a substantial variance being requested here, or that would exist, or at least a substantial difference, and that such a variance should be denied. In fact, we tried to resolve it because this is not a subject for a discussion relating to variance, but it's rather simply a discussion of the facts. It is, in fact, one building taller than the other. The other thing that's worth noting is, and it was alluded to by Ms. LeCount, is that under another section, Section 12.2, the zoning ordinance requires that if there are measurements to be taken in a situation where height is at issue, that it should be a matter of from the ground to the median point between the eave level and the ridge of the gabled property. And in this particular case, I think it's been acknowledged by the staff that they didn't take that measurement. So, in fact, we've got another situation here where the zoning department has denied, if you will, a zoning application by a citizen on the basis of what looked like it might be some difference, but then from a factual standpoint, I think there's substantial evidence that the way I've made reference to, but that you'll also hear to the effect that, in fact, there is no difference that requires a variance here, that, in fact, the accessory building is entirely in compliance with the zoning law. And I would submit one last thing in that regard, and that is that even if there is some variance, whether it's 1 inch, 2 inches, 6 inches, if somebody would go out and find a way and do measurements that in some way reflected some amount of difference, it is a de minimis amount. We're talking about 6 inches or less. And I guess from my client's standpoint, we would humbly request that if the panel would in fact be looking at this as a difference in height that would go the other direction, wherein somehow we have exceeded the particular requirement by 6 inches or less, that in fact there be either a variance permitted in that regard under the circumstances. It's clearly not substantial. But the other part of it is it's a tremendous benefit to my client to be able to have this storage facility for his family. It might be a good point at this point. I heard some reference about there being a complaint. I assume it may have been an anonymous complaint. I did try to find out a little bit more about it, but I could not. Didn't have that information readily available when I called over to the zoning office. But we do have a letter from all of the surrounding property owners, the adjoining property owners and those who are who are in fact the ones next door, the ones across the street. We've got a letter signed by all of them in which they say the location and the size is fine with them, and they have no problem with the storage shed that's been constructed. I'm wondering what would be the best way to present this. May I approach the chairman?
Certainly, and we'll take it as, I'll have the board review it, and it is a letter addressed to the Colerain Zoning Board, or to whomever it may concern. I've seen the storage shed that Henry has constructed on his property. I have no issues with the size and location in proximity to the property line. I have no objections to Henry's storage shed. And it's signed by 1, 2, 3, probably looks like 10 people, 11 people. So I'll let the board look at that. And please continue.
Thank you. Next, we get to the subject of the applicable law, and of course, without going into a lot of details that this board has probably heard repeatedly, and I will mention that the Ohio Supreme Court has looked at both the statute relating to variance 519.14B and in consideration of zoning cases relating to area or non-use cases, that court has found, in effect, that there are a number of factors that ought to be considered. And I've obviously looked at Colerain Township's list of factors, if you will, that are set forth in its staff report, the ones that Ms. LeCount and that department respond to, and they line up very well with what the Ohio Supreme Court has said. I noticed that there was one that was not specifically addressed, but that being that, did the individual seeking this particular variance, kind of come to the condition, or was this something that predated that? In this particular case, I'd mentioned that the Smith family has been at this residence since 1986, when they acquired this property, long before the zoning ordinance went into effect. And I might also mention that back in the early 1990s, Mr. Smith built the first structure on that property, the first storage shed. It was actually, what were the dimensions?
It was 18 by 28.
That was the original? That was the original, which is actually larger than the shed that has now been in the process of being constructed. But I mention that because at that particular point in time, there was no zoning enforcement. Mr. Smith was unaware of the fact. I know that ignorance of the law is ordinarily no excuse, but certainly some of the practicalities of daily living back in the 90s, it was not something that was required. No one had advised him of a change, and once again, when he hit the current year, he started construction as he had done so many years ago. But in any event, the Supreme Court, of course, has spoken about circumstances where there is a non-use or area-related variance being sought. And in this particular case, we're seeking a variance, a reduction, if you will, of the setback. And in those particular cases, the courts have looked to the question of what, including in Hamilton County, and I've seen a number of cases involving Colerain Township Zoning Board in years past, where, in fact, this very subject came up, and where it was not a matter of some undue hardship being imposed on the individual who is the applicant, but rather whether it would present practical difficulties if he was not given the variance in this particular situation. And as I think you're going to hear from Mr. Smith, in fact, there are circumstances here that would create practical difficulties for him if there was a requirement that this particular shed not be in this location, and not the fact, or not alone, that he has already substantially completed this structure, but rather other considerations. If he were starting from scratch and had to consider where should this be, that these would still be practical difficulties for him. Taking a look at frankly what the staff has recommended to the board, and hoping that I'd like to kind of follow the, if you will, what the staff has responded in this particular report, and trying to bring your attention to why this really is a different circumstance than what the staff has portrayed. First of all, I heard recited by Ms. LeCount that this is a substantial variance, because if you look at a 3 feet reduction compared to a 5-foot setback, that's a 60% reduction. But we're not looking at it, or what the reduction being requested shouldn't be looked at from the standpoint of percentages. Heck, 1 inch can be 50% of 2 inches. That's still a mighty small space. And in fact, what we're talking about here is really not a question when we talk about what is substantial of what percentage of that setback is it, but really it's what is the effect, if in fact there is this reduction, what is the effect on the community, on the public welfare and the safety and the comfort and the property values, if in fact this particular reduction of 3 feet is permitted. And then again, other factors require that one has to also look at what are the benefits that would be accorded to the Smith family if in fact this reduction was permitted. But I guess my point is that substantial, is the variance being requested substantial, has both a positive and a negative to it, and it certainly means more than just the number, as in what's the percentage of feet we're talking about, but really what is the impact on the public, and what is the impact on the property owner if in fact this variance would be granted versus not granted. So I think when Ms. LeCount makes the argument, or the staff makes the argument that this is a substantial variance, just look at the number. That is not where the analysis has to end, particularly when you're talking about a family's ability to be able to use its property in a meaningful way without any true harm to the public. Would the variance grant a consideration that's not available to other property owners in the neighborhood? Well, certainly other property owners in the neighborhood who have been subject to the zoning ordinances when their property was being developed have their properties laid out literally because it's under such supervision in ways that comply in terms of the backyard setback, the side setbacks, and other requirements of the zoning laws. The Smiths, however, came to a home that was built in 1965. And their property was by no means laid out in a way that would comply with the zoning laws of today. As a matter of fact, the back porch of a large back porch of their property, which is now enclosed and was enclosed many years ago, is 7 feet from the rear property line. And I'm talking about the backyard property line. They got 7 feet. And if you look at the diagram that I had provided, or you look at the building plan, you'll see that in terms of any consolidation or any place for consolidation of any kinds of improvements, it's really over on that driveway side. What the Smiths have tried to do with what they have is to keep what is in front of their house over on the west side and what's left of the backyard in an open and available condition. So as a practical matter, in this particular instance, it's not a situation of whether they're being granted some consideration which would not be available to others in the community. It's really the circumstances of their case, the property that they have that predated the zoning has made it necessary for them to have this particular accommodation. And others with more properly or appropriately developed properties have the ability to put an accessory building where it might be more serviceable or more consistent with zoning laws. I'd mention one other thing, and this is I think really just incredible. Again, the question, would the granting of this variance grant a consideration that's not available to other property owners in the neighborhood? Mr. Smith will tell you that he went around his entire neighborhood of several streets, I'm talking 5 or 6 streets, and visually examined each house as he went by, stopped anywhere he saw an accessory building that was within 5 feet of the side or rear property line.
I know you've prepared a lot of information, but I really want to focus on this one lot.
Right. Well, and what the question is, though, is this a consideration not available to other property owners in the neighborhood? There's 100 other property owners in the neighborhood who have accessory buildings within 2 feet.
And how many
or
of
within
that,
5
how
feet.
much of that is new construction?
Well,
we're talking about new construction on an existing property. And I don't really want to go into where the buildings that may have been put up 15, 20, 30 years ago. I really want to focus on new construction and its setback off the property line. That's, I think, the core issue. And
if neighbors have new sheds or accessory buildings, were they done legally? Did they go through the right channels?
Well, and that's a good question. In talking with the zoning department, I find that they don't really look unless someone has brought a complaint. So,
Sure,
I
that
mean,
happens all the time.
So I guess the question becomes, but ultimately, what really begs the question is if in fact these are not complying with the setback, and specifically, the Supreme Court actually says it a little bit differently. It says, if in fact Mr. Smith or an applicant would be allowed to have the reduction in setback that he's requesting, would that change the essential characteristic of the neighborhood? Would he be accorded somehow something different from what appeared to be the circumstances in the balance of the neighborhood? So Colerain Township has phrased it a little bit differently. The Supreme Court, I think, is a little bit more attuned to the question of whether allowing such a variance, what would be the detrimental effect, if you will, to the neighborhood. So I'll move on that point. Next item on the staff's recommendation, and again, it was responded to rather without really any kind of support as far as I could tell. Would the property in question likely yield a reasonable return without the variance? Well, in this particular case, the Smith family has no garage, and the Smith family has no basement. And the Smith family has, out of necessity, built a storage shed in the past, and in this particular case, had begun construction on a storage shed, which frankly would be storing, among other things, their lawn maintenance equipment, tools, supplies, their seasonal ornamentation, their household goods that just simply can't be stored in the house, and admittedly, two four-wheelers, which frankly can be housed elsewhere if need be, but frankly they have more than enough that needs to go into the shed. So this becomes an essential for them to have this particular shed. It's a necessity for their family, and for many, many years, for 30 years, they had a shed that was bigger than this one, sitting basically about 18 or 20 feet back behind where the shed is currently being constructed. It's been asserted that there are no unique topographic or site configuration issues related to this property which would prevent the reasonable application of the setback regulation. In this particular case, where this particular building has been constructed is 2 feet from the property line, which, by the way, allows for access to do any kind of weed maintenance or to maintain that side of the building or the fence. Beyond that, if one goes 8 feet, one is at the edge of the pad that runs alongside my client's house. And on that pad sits what's called a cargo trailer. That trailer has been put in that location because, among other things, Colerain Township wants those sorts of contraptions off of the driveway and out of sight. And it sits along the side of their house, and it sits there on a permanent basis, and it's used for them anytime they have any kind of property or cargo to transport the four-wheelers, and occasionally to provide for some storage. So between what is the door of this particular building, where that would be situated, and this particular trailer is a space of 8 feet. You heard mention of 18 feet. There's a space of 8 feet between where the trailer sits, with the width of this trailer, and the doors of the shed. And I would submit to you that in the case of the Smiths, they have a need, obviously, to bring things in and out of the shed. They have things that need to be transported, if they do in the cargo transport, and brought over into the shed. People just going to the backyard need to have some means of access, and 8 feet is what we're talking about here. I might also mention, I know that the panel is undoubtedly not thrilled to hear the discussion or much discussion on the subject of the fact that this particular building has already been constructed. And I realize that one can't create a situation and then rely on that situation in order to get some kind of zoning variance. But the law also follows the principle that, well, there's a saying that the law abhors a waste. And in fact, roughly $5,000 of materials were put into this shed. The shed is on blocks. The blocks support specific aspects of the shed itself, including weight-supporting walls. And if in fact the shed would be moved in any direction, it jeopardizes the stability and the safety of that particular shed. So when one talks a little bit about practical difficulties, when one includes in that consideration of its proximity to, 8 feet over is the trailer, you've got a situation where, well, let's put it this way. I don't think that if a person has taken steps, I'm not saying that should necessarily support their cause, but I don't think that it, on the other hand, that it has to be something that one looks at as a negative. Let's in fact, take some negative approach because this in fact does exist. If this was a clean slate, we would still have most, if not all, of the same arguments if in fact this shed was not constructed. Really, the last thing that the Supreme Court had talked about, and maybe most significantly relating to all of this, is when one looks at what the object of the zoning ordinance is, which is to provide for, some regulation for the comfort, the support, the safety, welfare of the community, that has to be balanced in terms of granting this, or balanced against the benefits that should be accorded to a property owner, what benefits of making use of their property in a way that may be beneficial or useful to that owner, and that one should do what substantial justice requires. Well, in this particular case, I guess first and foremost I would say that the staff made the recommendation that one should find thumbs down in that regard, that clearly the balance falls in favor of the public health and welfare and safety and comfort and so forth. And yet what was interesting about it is there's absolutely no discussion or analysis whatsoever of, okay, let's make an analysis here. What are the benefits that this property owner is seeking? Is this important to this property owner and his family? And then let's take a look at what the true detriment of the neighbor to the neighbors are. Is this really going to drive down property values? Is this really going to create some difficulty in terms of the providing a public service or be an eyesore? To simply say that, hey, you find in favor of a denial that justice requires that this be a thumbs down decision in this circumstance, I would say that it actually flips the other way, that in fact this is a substantial benefit to this family who needs this, absolutely needs this as it is, so that they can make use of this for the storage of their home goods and all of their tools and equipment and so forth. And I think that it does fall within the spirit and the intent of the zoning requirement. And I'll give you just a few ways that it quickly does.
Mr. Bergman, you've had the floor for about 40 minutes. I'd like you to really wrap it up so we can get some other discussion and perhaps some other people to address the board.
Okay, I appreciate that, and I'll do so. It's worth noting that this particular accessory building at 2 feet away from the property line is situated far enough away that we're not talking about, for example, something that one might want to avoid, possibly a property encroachment. I can understand the need for a setback, avoid property encroachment. Well, this is 2 feet away from the fence line. It does not allow this property is not in some place that would affect the providing of public services. That's already been acknowledged by the staff. There is sufficient space between the building and the fence for maintenance to be done. This building's setback, if one were driving through the neighborhood, would be no different from that 100 other homes that I mentioned. So it's not changing the character of the neighborhood or in some way causing detriment to others. Furthermore, and it's already been acknowledged, this particular building has replaced 2 other buildings. One, a fairly large woodshed that was in front of or actually sitting where this particular, the location of this particular building. but also a much larger storage shed that was sitting more toward the back of the property. Both of those were becoming dilapidated or were suffering from problems due to weathering and water intrusion and so forth. Those have been eliminated. So substantial justice can be done in this particular case if in fact, and frankly the interests of the zoning ordinance protected, if in fact Mr. Smith would be granted this particular variance. So we're really talking about a variance of 3 feet, basically a reduction of 3 feet so that the property could be built within 2 feet of the property line. And I guess I would say with respect to the height, while we believe there's no height difference, that the evidence would show there's no height difference, that in fact, if there would be a height difference, it's of such de minimis proportions that a variance should not be even required. But if one would be required, we would ask for that variance of up to 6 inches, if in fact that does indeed occur. Now, I guess the last thing that I would say, and I appreciate the patience of the board, I've not appeared before this board before, so I wasn't sure what time limitations I had or the appropriate manner of presenting this. I did seek to make some inquiry, even watched YouTube a few times, but was unable to determine how other attorneys might present their case. For what it's worth, I had come prepared this evening to present some testimony by Mr. Smith, but I'm not sure that I have the patience of the board. But this is a quasi-judicial proceeding, and in fact, if this would be ruled against us, I obviously would want to lay a record. So I'm a little bit at a point here where it's difficult for me to assess what the board would like me to do.
Thank you. Certainly we want to hear the information from Mr. Smith as well as other folks to give you a break. And if there's anyone else to speak in favor, we can certainly have you come back up if you want to question Mr. Smith, but let's see if anyone else wishes to speak in favor. Then, if there's no one else to speak in favor, we'll let you come up and continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Is there anyone else to speak in favor? Please state your name and address.
Rick Thomas, 2763 Wilson Avenue.
Thank you.
I live next door to him, and I have no problem with the building. It's a nice building. It looks very professional.
Okay. Good. Thank you. Anyone else? Yes, I would. Sir.
My name is Charles List, and I live at 10926 New Market Drive. Okay. I signed a bud list, by the way. But I've lived there for over 30 years, and the Smith have been there the entire time. Very good people, good, hardworking people. I have no problem with the shed or the old sheds. He didn't like the old sheds. He tore them down. He wanted a newer shed, safer, nicer. He can get all of it all in one location instead of the 2 locations. So that's all.
Thank you. Anyone else speak in favor? All right, Mr. Bergman, you may come up and continue. And please be efficient with your time and our patience.
Once again, I have a little bit of uncertainty here as to how to proceed. I've asked that Mr. Kohler be in attendance to try to establish the manner in which the measurements were conducted. It might be.
I thought your questions were going to be to Mr. Smith.
Well, actually, I had really 2 people in mind. Again, I couldn't seem to get, shall we say, the information that I was necessarily looking for in its entirety and talking with the zoning department. So I did have a few questions for Mr. Kohler, had asked that he be in attendance. I had about 5 minutes of questions for him relating to the measurements that were taken. I guess I would say that if there was no difference in terms of my description of how the measurements were taken and what those measurements were, I would not have to go through the process of examining Mr. Kohler.
I was just going to say that Mr. Bergman is entitled to cross-examination, Mr. Kohler, based on how he determined those measurements. And we actually made Mr. Kohler available. I told via email today to Mr. Bergman that he would be present today, unless he wanted to present any kind of stipulations. But
Thank you. Proceed.
Well, I guess I just heard the mention of the word stipulation. If in fact Mr. Kohler agrees with the recitation of the facts as I presented them regarding the manner in which this was measured, we could agree to that here and now. If not, then I'll proceed with the questioning.
Fine.
do you agree with the way he presented to the board how you measured?
Yes, I'm measured from the peak of the roof to the ground of both structures.
Well, let me go ahead and maybe just ask a few questions. Mr. Kohler, if I could, what is your position over at Colerain Township? I've not dealt with the department before.
Senior planner.
Okay. And in that regard, you had the occasion to become familiar with the property at 2775 Wilson Avenue?
That's correct.
And are you aware of any occasions when employees of your department went to that premises to take measurements of the house and the accessory building?
No one has taken measurements that I know of.
Other than you?
Other than me.
Okay. And when was it that you took those measurements?
It's the same date that I took the photographs. They are date stamped. Oops.
Is that like July 17th? Is that what we're speaking of?
I don't recall the date right off. Sorry about that. It was about 3 days before the reports went.
Before the staff report was due?
13th. September 13th is the day I was out there.
Is there any reason why measurements weren't taken before the notice of refusal was issued?
We did not have the plans for the house at that time.
Okay.
We didn't have information on the height of the house at that time.
The accessory structure.
At the time the refusal was written, we did have the plans for the accessory structure,
Yes.
which called the height at, was it 1310?
9 inches.
13.9.
Or 9.
Right. And so at that particular point in time, whether you had plans or not, you didn't go out after the certificate was applied for to measure the house or the accessory building.
Right.
And that wasn't really even done until a few days before the staff report was issued.
Correct.
Okay. You know any other occasions that it was measured?
Not that I'm aware.
And in terms of measuring the, I think you said you measured the house on the, was it the west or right side of the house?
Correct.
And as far as those measurements go, did you stand at the base of the wall in order to do your measurements?
Yes.
Got another handout, if you will.
Let the record reflect that the applicant has provided a photograph of the west end. Is that correct, of the house?
That is correct. And Mr. Kohler, would be fair to say, as you look at that particular photograph, is that in fact the appearance of the property at the time that you took your measurement?
Yes.
And would you agree, sir, that at the base of that particular wall there is a flower bed?
Right.
Did you stand in the flower bed in order to take your measurement?
Yes.
Okay. And did you measure from the peak down to the flower bed?
That's correct.
Mr. Bergman, I just want to say, for purposes of creating a record, can you please speak into the mic if possible?
I'm sorry. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Kohler, did you by any chance measure the height of the flower bed?
No, I did not.
Okay. Did you, at the time that you took that measurement, measure from the base of that wall up to the median point between the eaves and the peak of that particular gabled roof?
No, I did not.
Okay. And did you add to your computation of the height any amount for the ridge that runs along the top of that roof?
No, the measurement was from the ridge.
It was from what, the top lip of the peak?
Correct.
And are you aware that the ridge actually starts several inches behind the peak on the roof?
No.
Okay. As a matter of fact, you couldn't see the roof. You couldn't see a ridge up on the roof.
Not from the end of the building.
Okay. So if in fact we're dealing with a we'll say 3 to 4 inch flower bed, and we're dealing with a 2-inch ridge at the top of this particular gable, if in fact those things existed, would it be fair to say that your measurement did not include those items?
That's correct.
Thank you. And then as far as the measurement of the accessory building, gosh, there was a great photograph that was up there before of the accessory building. I wouldn't mind if that might pop up on the screen. I appreciate it greatly. One that depicts the fence in front of the accessory building. There we go. So in this particular case, you'll agree there was a fence and you stood outside the fence and taking your measurement?
Correct.
And you would agree that the building is set back from that fence?
Slightly.
Okay. If I were to tell you, if I were to represent to you that actually measures 27 inches from the fence line to the actual building, would you have reason to disagree with that?
That could be.
Okay. And so you made your measurement, what? Putting the tape measure on the ground and then measuring up and bending toward the peak of the building?
No. I extend the tape measure to the top of the building and then pull it to the ground.
And you pulled it to the ground outside of the fence line?
Correct.
Okay. Did you make any effort, strike that, forget that. Did you make any effort to measure from the ground to a median point between where the eaves appear and the gable of the building?
No, I did not.
So based on, if in fact that was the actual or the true test of whether one is higher than the other, you did not do that test with respect to that measurement with respect to either of those buildings, correct?
That's correct.
I don't have any further questions. Thank you, sir. Okay. If I might, then I'd like to ask a few questions of Mr. Smith. Could you state your name, please, for the record, and your home address?
My name's Henry Ray Smith. I live at 2775 Wilson Avenue.
And Mr. Smith, are you the owner of that residence?
My wife and I.
And how long have you owned that residence?
33 years.
I hate to say it, but I came prepared with handouts. Would you be able to identify your residence from photographs? The photographs presented?
Yes.
Are those photographs of your residence?
Thanks, Mike.
Yes, they are.
Okay, so the record reflects additional photographs of the residence provided by the attorney for...
And as you flip through the packet, if you would just maybe say a sentence about, or even less than that, about what each of the photographs depicts.
Well, the first one, we redone our flower beds and made them all nice.
That's the front of your house?
Yes, that is
Okay.
the front of the house. This is also the front showing
The second page is the what?
the western side and the front yard.
Okay, and the third page, what does that show?
That's the western side looking where the backyard is, looking toward the Pippin Road.
And at the base of that wall on the western side, is that where that flower bed appeared that Mr. Kohler spoke about?
Yes,
Okay,
yes it is.
and then if you would, now, just one last thing, and in the backyard there, I see projecting out, is that the enclosed porch in the backyard of your property?
Yes, that is.
All right, and then the last page?
That's the front with the driveway and the new shed right there.
Okay. And who resides at your home?
Me, my wife, and our 3 children.
Okay. And do they all have vehicles?
Yes, they do.
And where do they park their vehicles?
On the drive and the street.
Okay. And as far as the home construction, when was the house built?
I think 1965.
Does it have a basement?
No, it does not.
Does it have a garage?
No, it does not.
Have you made any other major changes? Was the enclosed porch that way when you built that, or when the house was purchased?
No.
Okay, and so at some point you enclosed the porch?
Yes.
How many years ago was that?
We enclosed the porch, I think, around 3 or 4 years ago.
Okay. But the patio in which that extended in the backyard, that was already there all the way back to?
Oh, that was, it was all the way back to where it is now, yes.
Okay, so you have really little actual backyard. Okay. As far as the site plan goes, did you, in connection with this case, put together a site plan?
Yes, I did.
Okay, and that's been previously provided to the panel and the staff?
Yes.
Okay. I'll hand you a copy of that document. Oh, looks like you've got a copy with you. And I see that there are well, first of all, I see that there are a number of things identified on the site plan, like house and buildings and so forth. Are those things that you actually, that depict the improvements on your property?
Yes.
And I see measurements that are indicated there. Are those measurements ones that you've taken?
Yes, it is.
Okay, and how is it that you came up with those measurements?
I put the tape measure out and measured each area that I needed to take measurements of.
Okay. I see that on the drawing it shows 2 references to existing woodshed and existing shed and existing shed, which I presume to be the original accessory building. Do you see where those 2 indications are?
Yes, I do.
As far as those indications, were those structures in existence when you applied for your zoning certificate?
Half of the shed was, yes.
So half of the original shed was existing. Was the woodshed in existence at that time when you applied for the certificate?
No.
Okay. Now, you heard some reference being made earlier to there having been some change in position by the staff relating to the removal of those buildings at some point after your application was made. So for clarification purposes, the woodshed was actually gone before you started on the new shed?
Correct.
You had taken that out and you would knock down how much of the original shed?
Restate the whole case.
The front side of
Right.
the shed.
And why hadn't you knocked down the rest of that shed?
Because I was keeping all of our things in there.
And I appreciate the back and forth questioning, but we've covered a lot of this ground before. Is this needed, Scott? I mean, do we need to reiterate?
Mr. Bergman, if he feels he needs to put on what he needs to put on.
Okay, all right, proceed.
Okay, so in terms of the original accessory building, that was built when?
Right around 93, maybe.
Okay, and what did you use that for after 1993?
We just used it for holiday decorations, things that we couldn't store in the house, lawnmowers, yard tools, toolboxes, tools, things like that.
Those things that you would have ordinarily stored in a basement or a garage?
Oh, yeah.
Got another handout if I might.
Please, Mr. Smith, could you please speak into the mic too?
Again, Chairman, in terms of the amount of time being expended, I attempted to make some diligent effort to find out procedurally what would be the best way to handle this, and I prepared my case as best I could. So please bear with me. I'll try to keep it germane to the subject at hand. In any event, as far as the original, as far as that original structure goes, the dimensions I think you mentioned earlier were 18 by 24, correct?
Yeah,
For the original?
No,
Or, I'm sorry.
18 by 28.
Okay, so that particular building was a larger building, and how far away was it from the rear property line?
From the rear property, it was right against the fence,
And as far as the side property line?
right at 2 feet.
Okay, so the new building is being constructed the same amount of distance away from the fence line, the eastern fence line, as the original, and the southern portion of the new building is actually considerable distance more away from that rear fence line, correct?
Oh, yes, correct.
Okay. And you already testified about the wood shed. We'll skip over that. As far as the driveway pad, when was that constructed?
I think 08, 09 maybe,
Okay. And that was constructed for the purpose of what?
to park the trailer next to the house.
Okay. And in fact, has that been parked there during the time since you've constructed that pad?
Yes.
Okay. And as far as the, now this replacement building, the one that we're here about, did you at some point in time decide that it was time for this original building to be replaced?
Yes, I did.
And why did you decide that that had to be replaced?
It was rotting down. It was leaking. It was ruining all my stuff.
Okay. And when you decided to replace it, did you, when was it that that decision was made?
A couple years back.
Okay. And why didn't you replace it immediately?
I saved up the money.
Okay.
Did it.
And back when you originally constructed this particular shed, the original shed, had you applied for a zoning certificate?
No, I did not.
For that matter, did you apply for any kind of building certificate or permit?
No, I did not.
Okay. And why was that?
I didn't know you needed one.
Okay. And in that particular point, and so as the years went by, at some point you decide you need to do a replacement, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And you mentioned 2 years ago you made a decision to replace it. I take it those 2 years went by. Did you do the saving that you intended to do in order to construct that building?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And what did the materials cost you in order to try to construct this new building? What was the plan?
Right at $5,000.
Okay. And so you began the replacement on the construction of the replacement building. Did anyone say anything to you during the course of your construction about the need for a zoning certificate or the need for a building permit?
No.
When was the first time that you actually heard from anyone relating to a need for a zoning certificate?
I believe it was on the 18th when I got a letter.
Okay.
18th of July.
And that indicated that there were violations by virtue of you initiating that without getting a zoning certificate.
Right, correct.
Had you known about the need to get a zoning certificate, would you have applied to get one?
Yes, I would have.
Would it be fair to say that you're sorry at this point that you did not apply to get a zoning certificate?
Yes, truly, or I wouldn't be here.
How far did you get with the construction of that replacement building before you received that notification?
Well, I got the tar paper on it. That was it.
Well, if you could be a little more specific about the construction.
It was, the structure was almost complete.
Except for what?
Putting the shingles on and putting the door on, putting a skirt around it, and the trim.
Okay. There had been some suggestion made by Ms. LeCount that when you were, that at some point after being advised of violations, that you continued with construction of that particular building. Is that true?
Well, I did go ahead and set the windows in it, but other than that, I didn't do nothing.
Okay. And why did you put windows in the building?
Because the rain was blowing in where the plywood was, there wasn't nothing there.
So you were concerned that there would be damage to the building if you didn't try to weather protect it?
Correct.
Okay. Are the shingles still not on that building?
Correct. They're in the driveway. You can see them.
Okay. And as far as the building itself, does this building at this point in time look like what appears here on the screen?
Yes, it does.
That's the condition that it's in?
Yep.
Okay. Is it being used for storage at this point?
No, just some wood that I got in there.
Okay.
Finish it up with.
Oh, the wood that you were going to use?
Right.
What did you, when was this original building demolished?
After the lady said to do it.
Okay, and when was that?
It's been 2, 3, 4 weeks ago, maybe. I'm not
Okay.
sure.
When you say the lady, you mean Ms. LeCount?
Ms. LeCount,
And
yeah.
you didn't speak to her directly, you spoke with me after I spoke with her?
Correct.
Okay. And what did you do with the material that was contained within that building?
All that material I hauled off to Rumpke.
Well, what I'm speaking of is what you had stored, I apologize. What was stored in the building, in that building, what did you do with it?
Oh, all the stuff. Is that what you
Yes,
said?
yes.
Oh, yeah, I had to go get a storage locker.
Okay. And you moved everything to that storage locker?
Yes.
What is that storage locker costing you?
That's $150 a month.
Okay, was that something that you budgeted for?
No.
Okay. Is that a hardship?
Yes.
In terms of inspecting the neighborhood, I understand that after you received notification of the refusal, that you actually conducted a survey of your neighborhood in terms of other homes that had adjoining or accessory buildings on them.
Yes.
Okay. And if you would just, I won't belabor the point, but how many homes did you find that appeared to have buildings that were within 5 feet of the fence line, at least, with respect to those properties?
100.
Okay. And how did you document those homes that you found that were of that had that condition?
Well, I got aerial pictures from the computer, and I took physical pictures from the ground.
Okay. And did you make any other documentation of the addresses at which you found those
Yes, I did.
those differences from the setback that we
Yes, I
talked
did.
about? And what was that
All the
documentation?
address. I wrote down all the addresses on a map.
Is that the map or the diagram you're referring to?
Yes.
Okay. Good.
And let the record reflect, we have another submission from the applicant indicating the area, his neighborhood, which has sheds that are on property lines that are less than 5 feet.
I don't see I didn't see the street names on that diagram. Were the street names actually on? Okay, can you indicate what the streets were for the record?
Yeah, there was Pippin Road, Stout, Butterwick, Hanoi's, Albo, Wilson, New Market. I believe that was it.
Okay, and those addresses that are indicated, the ones that are multiple digits, are those the addresses of the homes on those particular streets?
Yes.
And you've got further documentation, photographs and so forth, personally taken in aerial photographs?
Yes.
Regarding the measurement of your home, how did you actually measure the height of your home from the peak down to ground level?
Yes, I did.
Okay, and where did you conduct your measurement?
I did mine on the east side of the house, on the shed side, and that's where I met on the driveway.
Okay, and is that at ground level?
Yes.
Okay, and in other words, it's flush with the ground.
Yes.
Right. And as far as the accessory, well, and with respect to that same building, did you also conduct a measurement to the median point in the gable of that property?
Of the house?
Of the house.
Yes, I did.
Okay. Now, did you do the same kind of measurement with respect to the accessory building?
Yes.
Okay. And both from the ground to the peak?
Yes.
And from the ground to the midpoint of the gable?
Yes.
Okay. And going back to the house for a moment, did you also include in your measurement the ridge on the house? That is,
Yes.
that portion that runs
Ridge
along the
vent.
ridge, the ridge
Yes.
vent?
Yes.
Okay. And with respect to the two properties, did you find the measurements to be essentially the same?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And in terms of your visual inspection, did you find any difference as you looked at the two premises in terms of the height?
No, I did not.
And you heard Mr. Kohler testify as to where he took his measurement from with respect to the house. Is in fact there a multiple inch rise on the west side of the house where the flower garden appears?
Yes, there is.
Okay, and approximately how high would you say that rise
Say
is?
right at 4 inches.
Okay, and then going over to the fence in front of the accessory building. Did you have the occasion, first of all, to measure from the fence to the base of the accessory building?
Yes,
Okay, and how far is that?
right at 2 feet.
Okay. Okay, now I said earlier 27 inches.
Well,
Is it 2 feet or?
Yeah, it's 27 and a half.
Okay, well, 24, 27. The bottom line is it's roughly 2 feet from the fence line.
Correct.
So if one were to stand outside the fence and try to measure, well, from the peak down to the ground, the fence would intrude.
Yeah.
Okay, require that.
Yeah, your tape would be crooked there a little bit.
Right. Have you received any objection from any of your neighbors regarding the location or the size or the existence of this particular structure?
No, I have not.
Gentlemen, are we close to wrapping this up?
I think we're at that point, Your Honor, or pardon me, Mr. Chairman. I thank you very much for your attention.
Is there anyone to speak in opposition to this request for variance? If there's no one to speak in opposition, I'll ask for a motion to close the public portion of this hearing.
So moved.
Motion's been made. Is there a second?
Second.
Motion's been made and second. Discussion? If not, roll call vote, please.
Ms. Wilson?
Aye.
Mr. Bertolt?
Yes.
Mr. Hill?
Yes.
Mr. Shep?
Aye.
Mr. Reinger?
Aye. All right, now we'll start with questions from the board. We'll start with Mr. Hill.
Mr. Smith, you indicated the house was built in 65, is that correct?
Yes, I believe so, yes.
Did you actually build the house?
Oh, no, sir, no. I bought the house, I was the second owner. I
Okay, so
believe.
you were the second owner?
Yeah.
Okay. So did you get a copy of the plot plan for the property? Do you know what the actual measurements are? Are you basing this off of an engineered drawing, or is this more of just?
No, just myself.
Okay. No further questions?
That's line, you know.
Ms. Wilson?
I think I have more comments than questions. And I mean, I already know the answers to all the questions that I'm going to ask. It's just that truly, at the end of the day, as you stated, Mr. Bergman, and I do appreciate as a fellow officer of the court, I appreciate your presentation. However, I'm just concerned that the argument it glosses over the fact that, as you stated, you admittedly said that ignorance is no defense, and it is a fact that in this township you have to have some sort of approval from the administrator's office to build anything, especially once you've torn something down and replaced it. I think the issue for me is not so much, I mean, it is in a way the height of the accessory building and the height of the home, how it's measured. At the end of the day, you all admittedly, through your statements today and through your documents, not too far off from what Mr. Kohler measured. So I don't know if the board takes issue with the fact that it might be the same height as the house, but I do take issue with the fact that the project was started without a proper appropriate approval from the township. I take issue with the fact that it was continued in any way, shape, or form, even after being warned that it was not being built legally. And I also take issue with the fact that admittedly there's no proper setback from the property line of this accessory building. I further take issue with the argument that just because 100 other people in the neighborhood have something, but there's no explanation as to whether this is already existing or whatnot. But at the end of the day, as an officer of the court, you know that many people break laws all the time. They just don't get caught. But once they're caught, it's addressed. So I'm just having a real issue with trying to justify willful disregard for zoning rules and requirements prior to building anything to replace any structure, and continuing to do so even after being warned that that is not proper or legal. That's just the microwave version of where I stand here. And I mean, you're welcome to respond. However, I think you'll be repeating yourself because you've made it very clear what your position and Mr. Smith's position is in regard to the issues that I've brought up. That's all.
Thank you. Mr. Tripp?
I have none.
Okay. Mr. Bartle?
Well, just a couple comments also. So you admit you realize there are building codes and zoning codes?
Now I know. Yes.
So you say before this you had no idea there were such things out there?
No, sir.
And you mentioned a couple years ago you enclosed the porch.
Yes, sir.
And did you get a permit for that?
No, sir, I did not.
And do you plan on getting a permit for this accessory structure?
I hope so.
Code permit?
I hope so.
Or have they already been notified?
If I can add to that, we have had contact with the building permit folks with Hamilton County, and they've indicated that in a number of instances, people have inadvertently, or however you would like to characterize it, started structures or even gotten substantially along with structures and their construction, who then come to the building department for a building permit, and that provided that the plans are provided
Right.
that documentation is provided, they will treat it as any other project. They will not sanction them for having started the project. They want to see that it ultimately is done properly, and they will consider it.
And usually there's a fine of doubling the permit fees.
There may be, I did not get that far. I simply
But,
had reassurance that if in fact the zoning certificate was issued, that we could apply for a building permit and be treated appropriately in terms of proceeding with the project.
Right, so your foundations are how deep?
It's on block.
Right, how deep?
Well, there's two
From-
block in, and you're talking about ground level?
From the ground down.
From the 2 blocks, 8 inches.
Which is, yeah, so code says you have to be 32 inches down at the frost line so that the building doesn't heave. And so they would probably tell you, you got problems.
They're on 4-foot centers.
They have to be 32 inches below grade.
We certainly would like to have the opportunity to present.
So I'm
to
just
them.
saying, even if we were to approve
Right.
the variance, they might still have issues.
I might add, and directly to your point, they indicated to me that if in fact there was a design problem or if some rectification needed to be made, they would work with us, and they would in fact ask us to go back to the drawing board with our drawings, but not basically reject our project and allow us to continue to try to satisfy building code requirements.
Right. Well, that's really the only way to do it, is to have a 32-inch deep footer. But so you're basically coming to us with kind of what I've heard as dirty hands. You've done something that doesn't meet the code, and now you're asking for a variance or a blessing, and that makes it hard. The ridge, the height of the accessory building and the house, yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, if you measured them and Mr. Kohler's measured them, they're not off by much. If that was truly a variance, I don't have too much of a problem with the height issue, but you called that a minor issue, but you don't want to call being 3 feet into the setback a major issue to you. That sounded like you were trying to say it's not a big deal. But I think it is. That's pretty substantial. And there's always the other option. If a property owner has a piece of property and it doesn't suit their needs, I mean, a true option is you just find somewhere else that meets your needs, a house with a basement, or 2 acres of land, or you don't buy as many material things. You know, all those kind of issues can come up. And looking at the site plan, you have 8 feet between the driveway and the new shed, correct?
Correct.
And you're saying you can't have the shed closer to the driveway?
Yeah, it would make it pretty hard to get in and out of the door there with the trailer sitting there.
So why couldn't the doors be on the south side of the new accessory building?
I didn't build it like that, but.
Well, I know, but if you had gone to the zoning and they said, hey, you've got to meet setbacks, that would have pushed it closer to the driveway, which then would have forced you to put the doors on a side that would have worked.
Correct.
Okay, no other questions?
If I might respond just very briefly to a couple of things that were said. As far as the standard here, it's really practical. I just speak by way of the legal standard of it being practical difficulties. Would it create practical difficulties for the Smiths if in fact the variance were not permitted?
You've created the difficulties.
Well, see, that is the other part of it. If one looked at this purely in terms of a clean slate, if in fact this building had not even been constructed, this is why I said please don't hold it against them that it's constructed, but if we came to you with this plan without any construction, we still have the same considerations that we're talking about now. Moving the building closer to the trailer presents problems, and in terms of the other considerations that we talked about, those same things would apply.
Just move the doors to the south side and you can get in and out of it really easily.
And that would have been prior to him expending the monies for the materials and things of that nature. He could have saved himself a lot of hardship that he created on his own. Unfortunately, I'm sorry, Mr. Smith, had he followed the proper protocol. I mean, it's just that simple.
That's it.
Okay, just some comments. What is stored in the building again? What do you plan to store in there?
I have like my lawnmowers and tools and, just regular things, and then things for like holiday decorations, stuff that I don't store in the house that I can't.
Is there a grade level entrance to that building?
No, it's going to have like one little step up in there.
You said you had 4-wheelers. You mean you just run the 4-wheelers up the steps?
Well, I plan on keeping them in the trailer.
Oh, okay. I'm not struggling with the height or the area, only with the setback. A bone I often chew on is if you create your own problems and you come to the BZA to solve something you've created, I really struggle with that. You have a cargo trailer that takes up most of the width of that 10-foot driveway, and we're going to move the building 3 feet closer to the cargo trailer. You store things in a cargo trailer because you don't have a basement or a garage. I appreciate that. But you're creating some of your own problem. I don't have an issue with the height. I think that could be resolved. The area can be resolved. The setback, Mr. Hill brought up a pretty important point that we don't have clarity on, is where is the actual property line? I'm hoping that the property line doesn't run 6 inches inside that building.
I'm pretty sure it runs 6 inches out because there's another fence next to it.
That's all, there's another fence behind it. The stringers you've got coming out into the foundation blocks are going to keep you from running anything with wheels behind that. You really don't have a whole lot of space.
I didn't cut them off yet. I just left everything as is.
Okay, I've got no other comments or questions.
So I have a question to the staff. If this is denied, what happens? What do you physically or realistically do?
The applicant would need to, we would follow through on the enforcement process then. So either the applicant comes into compliance with what's currently in the code, or they would need to tear down the building.
Right.
That would be the compliance that we'd be looking for, one or the other.
All right, so at this point,
Couldn't they appeal to the courts as well? The decision of the BZA if it's
They
denied?
can, yes, I'm sorry, yes, they can.
all right, so at this point, I will ask for a motion to either approve or deny the request for variance, and it would be, well, height and setback.
Correct, just those two.
Correct, those are the two. If I heard some from the board that you might not have issue with the height, and so I don't know if that's based on Mr. Bergman's presentation that you don't believe that there's a variance needed, or if you just are okay with the variance. So I hope this board would clarify in their motion.
I think the height would have to be verified by actual physical measurement from the
Right,
highest
third
point.
party, a third party,
Yeah.
civil engineer or something.
Right, so we're still at the point where we either approve the variance, at this point be for the height, unless we can table the height and just move with the setback.
I'm sorry,
I don't want to split up the requests for variance, but if we have some contentious issue with the height needing to be verified, can we set that aside and just work on the setback?
I mean, it sounds like it. I don't know if the board would to consider continuing this motion. I don't know if that's to get actual measurements of the height, or I mean, take the evidence as it's been presented. I mean, it's up to the board. But if I would say that if you're gonna, depending on what the motion is, I would say, because I mean they're gonna appeal it if. Obviously, either or.
All right. I'll try and restate the motion. The motion is going to be focused on the setback requirement. To approve the motion means, to approve the variance means the setback is 2 feet is acceptable. To deny the variance means it has to be to 5 feet.
I think separating them makes the most sense at this point, like you're doing.
All right.
Was that a recommendation or an actual motion?
I'm asking for a motion. I can't make one.
Okay.
Thought you were going to make it.
So somebody needs to make a motion, otherwise we start this clock again next month.
I'll make a motion to deny the setback variance.
Right, a motion's been made to deny the setback variance. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Second by Ms. Wilson. Any other discussion? So we're focusing on the setback.
I do have a question.
Yeah.
With it, because I'm not 100% sure, but with it not being on a permanent foundation, is it able to be moved at all? I know that's going to be a lot, and I can't even understand practically how that can happen. Or are you able to just come up with some sort of plans to just bring the building into?
Well, the way I have it built is the center wall has blocks directly underneath it, and then the end walls, the weight-bearing walls too. If you move it off of there or try to, it'll sag. It'll be unsafe. It might fall.
That was just it, but my second still stands.
Okay. We have a motion to deny the variance and a second. In no other discussion, we'll call for a roll call vote. And aye means to deny the variance, and nay means to approve the variance. Is that clear? Is that okay? All right.
Mr. Shupp,
Nay.
Mr. Hill,
Yes.
Mr. Bartolt,
Yes.
Mrs. Wilson,
Aye.
Mr. Reinger,
Nay. So we have
3 in favor. So motion carries.
motion carries. Variance is approved.
Denied.
No.
No, the motion
To deny.
carried.
Motion was to deny.
The
Motion was to deny.
Correct.
Variance is not approved.
Yes.
My error. Right. That's all we can do.
Sorry.
And yes, there should also be, as with respect to the variance, the height variance too. I think a motion should be made on that as well.
I'll make a motion to.
Because both are appealable to the court of common pleas, so a decision needs to be made.
We don't want to, on a contingent that there is a difference between the two? Or just say that, I was going to say, in regards to the potential.
No, it's still a request for variance. There were two requests for variances that are still alive, and so the second variance needs to take a motion.
I would make a motion to accept the variance for the accessory building height.
Okay, motion's been made to accept the variance for the building height. Is there a second?
Yes.
Okay, the motion's been seconded to accept the variance for the building height. Roll call vote. Aye means to accept the variance.
Correct. Mr. Hill?
No.
Mr. Bartolt?
Yes.
Ms. Wilson?
Nay.
Mr. Shep?
Yay.
Mr. Reinger?
Aye.
Motion carries.
Okay, the motion carried for the variance on the height. Okay. All right, we're going to move on to the rest of the agenda. Thank you very much. All right, unfinished business. I have none. Is there any unfinished business, Ms. LeCompte?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Okay, then we have approval of minutes of August 22nd, 2018.
Staff is requesting a motion to defer the approval of those August 22nd minutes until the October meeting. We did not provide those in your packet.
All right. Defer, all right.
I was wondering.
I noticed that.
All right. Next meeting is October 24th, 2018. I do have administrative matter. I would like the staff to prepare a letter of appreciation to Tim for his years of service on the board. He has resigned from the board. I think he was on 3 years.
I don't know how long he was on there. I think it was a little longer than 3
Anyway,
years.
it's just something that I can sign, but to thank him for his time and his input, I think would be appropriate. We also have to move towards appointing a new member and finding new alternates, which is a trustee's purview, I assume.
That's correct.
It is the trustees. I intend to take a recommendation about one of your two alternate members to the Board of Trustees at their October meeting.
Okay.
That will leave one alternate position vacant through the rest of the year. But as you're aware, this time of year, we start asking for applications to take a look at potentially getting a new mix on each of our volunteer boards. There is one member's term that expires, and then one alternate member's term expires at the end of this year as well. So we will conduct we'll request applications and then conduct interviews and move forward to selecting and making sure we fill those positions appropriately before the January meeting.
Okay. Do I have the okay from the board to have a letter of appreciation drafted for Tim?
Yes.
I'm in agreement.
Yes.
Okay,
Do you
thank
want
you.
that brought back to your October meeting for you to sign, or do we send it out before then?
If it's drafted beforehand, I can always come in and sign it.
Okay.
We'll get that together for you.
Okay. Motion to adjourn.
So moved. Second. Second.
Motion made and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you all for your patience. Thank you, Mr. Coleman, for being with us.
And I just want to say, I know last time when
Hit the gavel.
this,
Hit the gavel.
yeah.